Party had an opportunity to sharply distinguish itself from the Republican Party. It began in 2006 and is in its heyday right now, where the Democrats have a massive majority in the Congress. They control the White House, and as things shift, they may even end up controlling the judicial branch of government. And so rather than sort of whining about how this isn't the change we can believe in and Obama hoodwinked us, I agree with Elaine that Obama telegraphed many of the passes, and certainly what Phyllis said, that we are now seeing him throw on the domestic and international stage. The Democrats, when they were elected in 2006, were largely elected to a majority, and when Nancy Pelosi swept to power, because people were fed up with the war. They were fed up with the Republican monopoly on government, with the out-of-control spending, with the bodies coming home from these wars, and they wanted change. The crowning achievement of Nancy Pelosi's time as Speaker of the House was to achieve approval ratings lower than those of President Bush, and it was an extraordinary achievement on her part. She had to work very hard to become less popular than President Bush, and almost as unpopular as Dick Cheney, the least popular politician in the history of this country, perhaps. And now we have a situation where even those Democrats that pledged to stand against war funding are backing down in the face of threats from the White House. I don't know how many of you followed what happened in June of this year, but there was an incredible opportunity for anti-war Democrats in the Congress to actually have power, to actually have a moment when they could impact real politics in the United States when it came to the issues that are important to anti-war people in this country. And that was when the White House attached $100 billion in funding to the International Monetary Fund to the Defense Authorization Bill. The reason why that's significant is because all of the Republicans voted against it with the exception of 5. What that meant is in order to pass the war funding bill for Afghanistan and Iraq, Barack Obama and Rahm Emanuel and Hillary Clinton had to have at least 39, they had to have at least 1 or 2 of the 39 solid anti-war votes turn, to flip them. And so what they did is Emanuel and Hillary Clinton and Obama began threatening freshman Democrats who were anti-war and saying, you will be a one-term congressperson if you do not vote with us on this bill. They said, you will never hear from us again. We won't raise money for you. We won't be there for you if you get into an intense re-election battle. Imagine being a first-term congressperson elected on a wave of this incredible support for Obama that we saw, unprecedented voter turnout, young people voting in huge droves. You rode to Congress on that, thinking that you were a part of something that was going to change Washington, and then the first big vote where you're going to represent what you told your constituents you would vote for, you then have to back down and turn or flip. And so they flipped some of those anti-war Democrats. And that authorization passed very, very narrowly. I talked to one congressperson who told me that they received a phone call personally from President Obama asking them to flip their vote, despite the fact that they had signed a pledge not to vote for war funding. In the Senate, you only had 3 senators vote against the war funding the last time around. Predictably, Bernie Sanders, and then also Russ Feingold, who, while still not fully around to the position that the United States should be completely out of Afghanistan, is increasingly moving toward that position. I tell you this story because what this means is that we have only 30 representatives in the House that actually have stood against the war. 30 out of 256 Democrats. We have 30 that actually have stood against the war. In the Senate, we have, from the Democrats, 1. Russ Feingold, the lone Democrat to vote against that funding. Bernie Sanders is technically not a Democrat, he's an independent. 1 Democrat in the Senate, 30 in the House. What that means is that the war party has the supermajority. The war party doesn't have to worry about its trough being drained. It doesn't have to worry about its funding being cut off, because the anti-war Democrats have been intimidated, bullied, and some of them had their spines surgically removed, and that's why they didn't vote with their constituents or vote with their pledges. So we had 51 Democrats in total that had said they would vote against the war and then didn't. vote against war funding when it mattered. They voted against it when it didn't matter early on, and then flipped their votes 2 months later. What also happened was that Rahm Emanuel cut deals with the Republicans and promised to go light on certain Republicans in 2010, and they flipped a handful of Republicans in that vote and got 5 of them to vote with the White House, despite the fact that the IMF money was attached to it. So who is Bennis? When we talk about defense reform, as the phrase has been put out there, Obama has been an incredibly successful reformer, because he's reformed the support for the war now that a Democrat is in power. Those Democrats that did spine up and would stand up against Bush, and there were only a few of them, many of them now have kind of been pulled over to the Obama camp under the guise of Afghanistan being the good war. When I was at the Democratic National Convention in Denver, I ran into Jesse Jackson after Obama's speech. And I went up to him and I said, Reverend Jackson, we heard tonight Barack Obama invoking the legacy of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King's son spoke before Obama at the when he won the nomination, the coronation. And I saw Jesse Jackson and I said, we heard a lot of talk about Martin Luther King in a speech where the candidate elected by the Democrats to be their candidate has actually called for an escalation of war. Isn't there a conflict between those two concepts, where you have an invocation of Martin Luther King's name, a committed pacifist who at great personal risk stood against the war in Vietnam at a time when he was being told by some civil rights activists that it would be a distraction from the civil rights issue. Quite likely the reason why he was killed was uniting people on class, racial, and then anti-war grounds. And then you have Jesse Jackson, who was standing on the balcony with him at the Lorraine Motel when he was killed, and it was sad because Jesse Jackson started saying that he thinks that Martin Luther King would have supported World War II because it was a just war. And he started talking about the theology of the just war theory. I went back and looked. Martin Luther King was emphatic in his pacifism, both strategically and morally. And so I tell that story not to bash Jesse Jackson, because he's actually come around and is speaking against the war in Afghanistan. But when it mattered, when it mattered, which was before Barack Obama got the nomination, you had utter silence on the part of most Democrats that were all up in arms about how Bush was a war criminal and Bush was leading the country into illegal and illegitimate wars. What about